Hey, tonight we're diving into the real Wild West. Not the Hollywood version with brave cowboys and showdowns, but the raw, dangerous place where survival wasn't promised. Think you could handle it? Let's find out. If you're enjoying these stories, a quick like or subscribe helps more than you know. Drop a comment with your location and time. We love seeing this global community grow. Now dim the lights, turn on a fan, and let's begin. You've just woken up in the 1870s American frontier. Cool, right? Not really. First thing that hits you, the smell. It's not fresh mountain air. It's sweat, animal waste, and sewage. Bathing was a rare luxury. Some didn't bathe all winter. Water was too valuable for washing. Your bed. Likely a straw mattress full of bugs. Your body aches. Life out here means hard labor. No breaks, no weekends, no mercy. Whether farming, mining, or ranching, your body worked till it failed. People were worn out by their 30s. If it's winter, your cabin is freezing. Summer? You'll sweat through every layer. Clothing was limited, scratchy, and rarely cleaned. Women wore heavy dresses year-round. That stylish Western look from movies? Fiction. Hungry? Hope you like beans, biscuits, and bitter coffee every day. No fresh produce, barely any meat, and scurvy was common. Coffee? Boiled to death, with eggshells or salt to cut the bitterness. Check your boots. There might be scorpions or snakes inside. Outside, you're exposed to the brutal elements. Weather turned deadly fast. Blizzards, droughts, floods. Towns offered little safety. They were dirty, crowded, and disease-ridden. No sewers, no germ theory. Cholera, smallpox, TB, they killed quickly. Streets were mud or dust, horse manure everywhere. Flies swarmed. Sanitation didn't exist. Saloons weren't glamorous, just loud, rough places with bad booze that could blind you. Violence was common, not in duels, but drunken brawls with armed people. Everyone carried weapons, mostly for animals or hunting. Ironically, many towns had gun control laws. The OK Corral gunfight started because someone wouldn't disarm. Doctors were barely trained. Surgery had no anesthesia. Infections meant amputations or death. Childbirth was deadly. Dentistry? Pure pain. A simple cut could kill you. In the Wild West, survival took more than courage. It took luck, toughness, and a whole lot of grit. Blizzards, tornadoes, floods, or droughts could strike without warning, deadly for the unprepared. The sky may look calm now, but that could change in minutes. Living in a frontier town might feel safer, but it came with new threats. Towns were disease hotspots. With no sewers or germ knowledge, sickness spread fast. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, tuberculosis. Outbreaks could wipe out half the population in weeks. If you visited a town, you'd notice its chaotic layout. Buildings popped up wherever. Streets were dirt, mud pits in rain, dust bowls in heat. Horse manure filled the roads, no sanitation in sight. Waste piled up, flies swarmed, and illness thrived. You'd pass the saloon, the busiest place in town, but not the glamorized version from films, just a rough one-room bar. The alcohol? Harsh, unfiltered, sometimes laced with dangerous stuff like pepper or turpentine. One drink might blind you. Saloons were magnets for violence, not duels, but drunken fights that escalated fast. Guns were everywhere, but not for showdowns, mainly for hunting, defense from animals, or signaling. Ironically, many towns enforced strict gun laws. Dodge City, Tombstone. They made visitors surrender weapons. The OK Corral shootout? It began over refusing to disarm. Hollywood's clean duels at high noon? Myth. Real violence was sudden, messy, and unfair. walk past the doctor's office and prepare for horror. Most had no real training. Surgery was done with whiskey or morphine, no sterilization. An infected cut could cost a limb or your life. Treatments included bloodletting, mercury, even arsenic, often worse than the illness. Childbirth was deadly. Up to 1 in 4 women died in remote areas. Dentistry meant painful extractions with crude tools and no anesthesia. Most lived with aching teeth until they lost them. On the frontier, getting sick or injured usually meant one thing: survival depended more on luck than medicine. Only the strong survive wasn't just a saying. It was reality in the Wild West. Around lunchtime, your stomach growls again. You find a restaurant, likely just someone's kitchen turned eatery. The food? No better than breakfast. Meat's tough or spoiled, veggies are rare and boiled to mush. No hygiene standards mean food poisoning and dysentery were common. While eating, you hear talk of Indian attacks, outlaws, and the dangers of solo travel. Native violence was exaggerated. Most aggression came from settlers and the military. Still, tensions from land seizure often led to bloody clashes. Outlaws, however, were real threats, especially in isolated areas. Lawmen were few. A single sheriff might cover hundreds of miles. In many towns, justice meant vigilante mobs, not courts. An accusation of theft could end with you hanging before nightfall, innocent or not. Later, you stop by the general store. Prices shock you. Due to costly transport, basics like canned fruit could cost $20 today. Settlers spent nearly everything on survival. The store also reminds you of another hardship: extreme isolation. Mail was slow, newspapers outdated, and many never heard. Dark clouds form in the afternoon. Storms were more than an inconvenience. They killed. Without forecasts, people were caught off guard. Blizzards froze travelers, tornadoes leveled towns, and floods swept away wagons. Droughts meant famine. Your house, if you had one, was poorly built. Sod huts, log cabins, or flimsy wood shacks offered little protection. Inside, temps could freeze in winter and roast in summer, especially where people slept. As the storm nears, you rush back to your cabin. On the way, you pass miners. Mining was deadly. Collapses, toxic gas, explosions, and long-term illnesses like black lung or mercury poisoning were common. But mining wasn't the only dangerous job. Farming used unsafe tools. Ranching meant wrangling huge wild animals. Logging, among the deadliest trades. Nearly all frontier work carried high risk of injury or death. You reach your leaking cabin as rain begins. Buckets go down to catch water. Ironically, this is also a chance to restock your drinking supply. Clean water was rare. Most settlers drank from shared sources used by people and livestock, leading to deadly diseases. As you sit in your damp, creaky cabin listening to the rain, you realize just how far the truth of frontier life strays from romantic legend. There were no true heroes or villains, just people doing what they could to survive. That any of them did is proof of human resilience. With no electricity, night comes quickly. Your only light comes from candles or oil lamps, and fire is a constant fear. One spark could destroy everything, and there was no fire department to save you. Many towns burned at least once. You get ready for bed, exhausted. Your body aches, your stomach feels off, and your mind is worn down from being on alert all day. As you drift into sleep, you wonder if you'll even survive tomorrow, or become another forgotten casualty of the frontier. The wind howls, reminding you how powerless humans were against the wild. If morning comes, it won't bring rest, just more hardship. In the West, survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned, painfully, every hour. Most modern people can't imagine it. Sunlight slips through the cabin walls and wakes you from a restless sleep. Your back is sore from the hard mattress, but there's no time to rest. Yesterday was brutal, and today might be worse. Let's say you plan to travel today, maybe to a nearby town or with a wagon train west. Travel in the 1870s wasn't easy. Yes, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, linking east and west. But unless you were wealthy or heading to a major city, you couldn't afford it. Most settlers traveled by horse, wagon, or even on foot. If you had a horse, you were lucky. A good one cost months of wages, and upkeep was expensive. Saddles, feed, and care added up, though care often meant putting the horse down if it was injured. Riding was no joy either. Saddles weren't built for comfort. Long hours left even veterans sore and blistered. And if the horse spooked, common in the wild, you could be thrown and badly hurt, far from help. No horse? You might take a wagon. But forget the cheerful scenes in old movies. Wagons were rough, without real suspension. Every bump jolted your body. Many passengers got wagon sickness, a dusty, miserable version of seasickness. Roads were just dirt paths, often muddy in rain or dusty in drought. Wheels cracked, axles snapped. If that happened, you might be stranded miles from help. Now, let's say you join a wagon train heading to California or Oregon along the Oregon Trail. That 2,000-mile journey was among the most dangerous things a person could attempt. Between the 1840s and 1860s, nearly 400,000 people tried it. Around 1 in 10 didn't make it. The Oregon Trail was known as America's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate 10 to 15 people died per mile, meaning a grave every few hundred feet, stretching across 2,000 miles. Makeshift graves, wooden crosses, and stone markers lined the Oregon Trail, many unmarked as families buried loved ones and pressed on. Disease was the #1 killer. Cholera, spread through dirty water, was especially deadly, causing severe dehydration that could kill within hours. No treatments existed, and outbreaks could wipe out dozens in a single wagon train. Other illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever were also rampant. Children were the most vulnerable. Many families lost several along the way. Medical care was primitive, often relying on ineffective folk remedies that sometimes worsened the condition. River crossings brought more danger. Most wagons weren't built to float, but had to cross deep rivers regardless. Some had ferries or shallow fords, but many attempted to float their wagons. Many drowned. People, animals, and supplies lost. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers claimed hundreds of lives. Despite myths, Native American attacks were rare. In fact, many tribes helped migrants, offering food, directions, and aid at river crossings. The real dangers were accidents, falling under wagon wheels, being kicked by oxen, or drowning. The emotional toll was just as brutal. Families often buried children, spouses, or parents, then had to keep going. There was no time for grief. Every delay risked being trapped by snow in the mountains. Constant stress, death, and exhaustion led many to mental collapse. Suicide wasn't uncommon. And even if you survived the trail, the struggle wasn't over. Many reached Oregon or California penniless, sick and starving, only to find that the promised land had its own challenges. But maybe you chose a shorter trip to a nearby town instead. Even local travel was risky. Outlaws targeted small groups or lone travelers. Stagecoach robberies weren't daily events, but happened often enough to worry about. Nature was no less dangerous. Flash floods could erase trails in seconds. Desert heat killed with dehydration, and blizzards in winter could trap travelers, leading to death or desperation, like in the infamous Donner Party tragedy. Finding your way was hard, too. There were few maps. Travelers used vague directions, landmarks that might shift or vanish, and guides who could be wrong. Getting lost meant running out of supplies, and often, death. As you push forward, you notice something movies rarely show: the incredible diversity of the Wild West. It wasn't just white settlers and cowboys. It was a melting pot. Chinese immigrants worked as railroad builders, miners, and shopkeepers. Mexican families had long lived in the Southwest before it became U.S. land. Black cowboys made up a quarter of ranch hands. European immigrants, German, Irish, Italian, Scandinavian, brought their own cultures. And indigenous nations had lived on this land for thousands of years. Others arrived. But this diversity didn't mean equality. Racial violence was part of daily life. Chinese railroad workers faced constant discrimination, forced into the most dangerous jobs for lower pay. Mexican landowners lost property through legal loopholes or outright theft after the Mexican-American War. Black Americans fleeing the South found that racism still existed on the frontier, just in new forms. Though they played vital roles in ranching, mining, and town building, they were often excluded from economic and social opportunities. For Native Americans, westward expansion was catastrophic. From an estimated 15 million, their numbers fell below 300,000 by 1900, decimated by disease, war, forced relocations, and the mass slaughter of buffalo, their primary food source. Government policies pushed tribes onto remote, poor reservations. Treaties were frequently broken when resources were found on native land. Children were taken from families and placed in boarding schools, aiming to erase their identity, under the cruel motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Hollywood's cowboys versus Indians stories ignore these realities. In truth, many tribes first tried peaceful coexistence and adaptation. Violence usually followed broken promises, land grabs, or provocation. As your journey continues, you reflect on another overlooked group: women of the frontier. Far from helpless, these women endured back-breaking work while navigating strict social roles. On farms, they cooked, cleaned, raised children, made clothes, and also farmed, tended animals, and defended their homes when needed. Their days were long, starting before sunrise and ending late. A frontier woman might plow in the morning, help with a neighbor's childbirth by noon, fend off wild animals in the afternoon, and still make dinner for her family that night. Many were widowed young and left to manage households alone. Yet despite their importance, women had few rights. Most couldn't vote, own property if married, or gain custody in divorce. Abuse was often ignored by the law. Unmarried women had limited options. Teaching was one of few acceptable careers, but paid poorly, often ending once they married. Some women found independence running boarding houses, sewing, or working as nurses. Others became soiled doves, prostitutes in brothels or saloons. While romanticized later, their lives were harsh, marked. Still, the frontier offered some women more freedom than back east. A gender imbalance gave them greater choice in marriage, and sometimes better treatment in communities that wanted to retain them. Territories like Wyoming and Utah granted voting rights decades ahead of the rest of the country, recognizing women's essential role in shaping the frontier. As the day wears on and your journey continues, you begin to wonder, what kept law and order in such a wild place? Law enforcement in the so-called lawless frontier was more nuanced than legends suggest. Cities and larger towns had some form of police, but rural areas were often left unprotected. County sheriffs, elected officials, were responsible for enormous areas, sometimes thousands of square miles. Regular patrols were impossible, so they relied on deputizing citizens and forming posses to respond to crime or emergencies. Inside towns, marshals kept order, sometimes with a few deputies. These jobs were dangerous and low-paid, attracting both genuine public servants and those drawn to the power of the badge. Even legendary figures like Wyatt Earp often drifted between law enforcement and morally gray activities. Federal marshals had broad jurisdiction but were few, focusing on major crimes like mail robbery or counterfeiting. The lone U.S. Marshal cleaning up a wild town? Mostly myth. In many frontier communities, justice was handled informally. Vigilante groups emerged where official law failed. And those famous quick-draw duels. Rare. Most violence was impulsive. Bar fights, land disputes, or domestic altercations, often fueled by alcohol. Punishment was swift and severe. Hanging was standard for crimes like murder, rape, and even horse theft. Prisons existed, but they were crude, unsanitary, and deadly. Many towns preferred executions over long-term incarceration. As night falls, you search for shelter. If you're lucky, there's a hotel or boarding house. But don't expect comfort. Rooms were basic: a bed possibly infested with bedbugs, a shared outhouse, and thin walls offering little privacy. Sometimes, you'd even share a bed with a stranger during peak times. Rates ranged from 25 cents to $1, several hours' wages. To save money, many chose barns, stables, or sleeping under the stars despite the dangers. If you're camping in the wild, you'd need to build a fire, assuming you could find fuel, cook from sparse supplies, and sleep with little protection from animals or weather. Skilled travelers like scouts, indigenous groups, or military units had reliable camping techniques, but settlers often made serious mistakes. Build a fire too large, and you risk a massive wildfire. Too small, and you freeze overnight. Camp cooking wasn't easy either. Many meals ended up half raw and half burnt. Now the night is fully upon you. You lie down on the cold ground, wrapped in a thin blanket or coat, listening to the wild. Coyotes howl in the distance. Birds cry in the dark. The wind brushes through trees and prairie grass. You close your eyes, knowing you'll need all your strength to survive tomorrow. For people used to modern lighting and noise, the total darkness and eerie sounds of the wilderness often caused intense anxiety. Sleep was hard to come by, not just due to physical discomfort, but the fear of unknown threats in the night. Though rare, native attacks sometimes came at dawn, catching camps at their most vulnerable. Predators like wolves, bears, and mountain lions might sneak in looking for food. Venomous snakes or scorpions sought warmth, sometimes inside bedrolls. Even without actual danger, the stress of staying alert every night wore people down. Frontier journals often mention exhaustion, not just from labor, but from constant mental strain. Those used to locks, alarms, and populated areas would find sleeping outside with no protection deeply unsettling. As you finally drift off, you reflect on the day. Frontier travel was nothing like the romantic portrayals. It was hard, dangerous, and unforgiving. Skills like navigation, repairs, and safe firearm handling took years to master, and mistakes were often fatal. The darkness thickens. Night sounds grow louder. If you live through the night, perhaps you'll reach your destination. Or maybe you'll become one more unmarked grave beside the trail. The Wild West offered no forgiveness and few second chances. Every dawn was a victory. Morning arrives. You've survived, and that alone is a win. As you stretch your sore muscles, you weigh your next move. Maybe today you'll seek fortune in a mining town, drawn by stories of the California gold rush, Nevada's silver, or Colorado's booming camps. Tales of men striking it rich with fist-sized nuggets drew thousands west, but those stories left out the brutal truth. If you tried your hand at mining, first you'd need to find and register a claim, already difficult by the 1870s, as the best land was long taken. Even if you succeeded, the work ahead was grueling. Placer mining, sifting through river sediment for gold, meant spending hours hunched in freezing water, your hands cracked and bleeding, your back aching, for maybe a few flakes of gold worth mere cents. Hard rock mining was even worse. Tunneling into unstable mountains without safety gear led to frequent cave-ins. Poison gases like carbon monoxide killed without warning. Explosives caused horrific injuries. Miners lost limbs or lives from premature blasts or flying rock. The constant noise left many with hearing damage. Those who survived faced long-term illness. Breathing in fine dust caused silicosis, a slow, suffocating lung disease. Mercury used in gold extraction led to tremors, confusion, and mental decline. Lead and copper miners absorbed toxic metals that destroyed their organs over time. There were no safety rules. Mine owners prioritized profits, and injuries were just part of the job. Medical help was poor. A serious injury meant the end of your work and no compensation, just poverty and pain. And the payoff? Despite the myths, most miners earned barely enough to live. By the 1870s, most worked for big companies, making $2 to $3 a day for 10 to 12 hours of brutal labor. Ironically, saloon owners, shopkeepers, and prostitutes often earned more than the miners who kept the towns alive. Mining towns were famously rough. Imagine a place full of young, single men doing dangerous work, with few women or stabilizing influences. Alcohol flowed freely. Miners drank several times more than the average American today. Violence was constant. Bar fights, stabbings, and shootings were common. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Waste piled up in streets and streams. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly. In hot months, the stench was overpowering, and flies carried disease from waste to food. Even if you struck gold, turning it into money was another challenge. Many towns lacked banks, so miners had to carry their gold, making them targets. Saloons and stores offered to buy it, but paid far below market value. Where banks did exist, they were barely regulated. Fraud was rampant, and many people lost everything when shady bankers disappeared with their funds. Without national currency backing, paper money issued by private banks fluctuated in value. Counterfeits were common. Even seasoned merchants got fooled. Gold and silver coins were safest, but also the biggest targets for robbery. After weighing the risks, maybe you'd try ranching. In the 1870s, beef demand was booming. But ranching came with its own perils. Starting required heavy investment: land, cattle, gear, and buildings. Many went into debt, gambling on good weather and market prices. Nature, however, rarely cooperated. Droughts dried pastures and killed cattle. Harsh winters, like the Great Die-Up of 1886 to 87, wiped out 90% of herds in some areas. Disease like anthrax or Texas fever could Cattle drives, moving herds hundreds of miles, were far from romantic. Cowboys, often poor young men, many black, Mexican, or mixed race, worked up to 20 hours a day. They slept in saddles and ate beans and salt pork. Medical care was limited to folk remedies. Injuries often went untreated, leading to death. Stampedes were a cowboy's nightmare, triggered by lightning or even a twig snap, turning thousands of panicked animals into a deadly wave. Many cowboys died under the hooves. With ranching proving just as dangerous, farming seemed like a safer path. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres to settlers who'd live on and improve the land for 5 years. It sounded ideal. But in the arid West, 160 acres often wasn't enough to sustain a family. Eastern farming methods failed. Many settlers lacked the knowledge for dryland farming. Starting a farm was brutal. Building shelter, usually a sod house, meant cutting and stacking thick prairie grass. These homes were dark, leaky, and infested with insects. Breaking the soil took months of back-breaking labor with crude tools. Many suffered permanent injury. Once planted, crops faced droughts, floods, frost, and plagues of grasshoppers that devoured everything, even wood tool handles. Illness during key seasons could mean starvation. Women worked the fields while heavily pregnant or just after giving birth because the work couldn't wait. Farm accidents were frequent. Homemade tools failed, animals panicked, and grain storage collapses could bury people alive. Frontier isolation also crushed spirits. Neighbors might be miles away. Women often went months without speaking to anyone outside their household, leading to depression and what was called prairie madness. Even when crops succeeded, farmers faced economic traps. Without refrigeration, perishable goods had to be sold fast. Railroads and corporations kept transport prices high and crop prices low, squeezing independent farmers from both ends. By the 1870s, many turned to wage labor in towns and industries, hoping for stability. But factory and construction jobs had no safety standards. Workers lost limbs to machines. Builders fell from great heights without harnesses. Railroads were among the deadliest jobs, especially for Chinese laborers, who were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, like blasting through mountains. Workdays were long, 10 to 12 hours, 6 days a week, for poor pay. Child labor was widespread. Kids as young as 8 worked alongside adults, often suffering more injuries due to their small size and inexperience. Workers had no legal protections. They could be fired without reason, have wages cut or withheld, and those who organized for better conditions were blacklisted, shut out from jobs across the region. Company towns, where one employer owned all housing and stores, were common in mining and lumber regions. Workers often paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company-owned housing, and were sometimes paid in scrip, currency only valid within the company's ecosystem. This system kept them in a cycle of debt with no realistic way out. No matter your path, mining, ranching, farming, or wage work, frontier life shaped people in ways hard to grasp today. Time itself felt different. Without clocks or electricity, life was governed by daylight and the seasons. Punctuality, as we understand it, barely applied. After breakfast, or before sundown, were accurate enough. Outside train or stagecoach schedules, exact time rarely mattered. Evenings were quiet and simple. After long days, most people didn't have energy for elaborate pastimes. They gathered around fires, told stories, played cards, or listened to music, if someone had an instrument like a fiddle or harmonica. Books were rare and cherished, often read aloud to groups or passed among families until they fell apart. Newspapers were read and reread until every line was memorized. Sports existed, though simpler. Informal baseball, horse races, shooting matches, and wrestling served as both fun and skill practice. Kids played games needing little more than imagination: tag, hide and seek, or stickball with homemade gear. Holidays were deeply valued. The 4th of July brought picnics, speeches, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked hard-earned success, and religious holidays offered both meaning and much-needed breaks. As night falls, you reflect again. Every part of frontier life demanded more effort, involved more risk, and gave less comfort than modern life. The people who endured it weren't legendary heroes. They were real, flawed, strong-willed individuals who faced brutal odds with limited resources. Their survival was built on resilience, adaptability, and endurance. Now the silence deepens. No engines, no lights, just wind, insects, and the distant cry of a bird. This pure silence, unfamiliar to modern ears, was the soundtrack of frontier nights, sometimes peaceful, sometimes terrifying. You lie beneath a sky ablaze with stars, brighter than anything most people today ever see. The Milky Way arcs overhead, connecting you to generations who looked up at the same sky for comfort, wonder, and hope. Morning comes again, and with it, hunger. Food on the frontier was simple and limited. Game like deer, rabbit, or birds could be hunted. But ammo was costly and time-consuming to use, especially during busy seasons. Most families relied on bulk staples: beans, cornmeal, salt pork, calorie-rich but repetitive and nutritionally poor. Fresh fruits or vegetables were rare, only available in season. Winter diets often lacked any produce at all, leading to deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was common in late winter. Bleeding gums, aching joints, and death were well known but hard to prevent. Other deficiencies stunted children's growth and harmed adult health. Preserving food was essential. Without refrigeration, meat had to be smoked, salted, or dried. These methods reduced nutrition and altered taste. Salt-heavy diets contributed to long-term health issues. Women spent countless hours pickling, drying, or storing produce, work that directly affected winter survival. Storage came with risks. Poorly preserved food could rot or cause deadly illness. Rodents and insects often got into supplies. Most families accepted that some flour or beans would include insect fragments or rodent droppings, just part of life. Cooking on the frontier was far more labor-intensive than most people today can imagine. Meals were prepared over open fires or wood-burning stoves, which needed constant tending and fuel. In treeless prairie areas, women and children often spent hours collecting buffalo chips, dried manure, or twisted grass just to keep the fire going. Water had to be hauled by hand, hundreds of pounds each day, from wells or streams, for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Even with such effort, meals were plain and repetitive. Spices were rare and expensive. Sugar and coffee were luxuries, saved for special occasions. Fresh milk was only available if the family owned a cow, and only while it was producing. Most frontier children grew up on monotonous, limited diets that would horrify modern nutritionists. Interestingly, obesity was rare, not because of health, but due to food scarcity and constant physical labor. Malnutrition was common even when people consumed enough calories to function. Beyond daily survival, raising children on the frontier presented its own unique challenges. Childhood, as we know it today, did not exist. By age 6 or 7, children were expected to contribute real labor, not chores, but tasks essential to family survival. Young kids herded livestock, gathered eggs, tended gardens, watched siblings, and more. By 10 or 12, most worked nearly full-time. Boys followed their fathers into fields and barns. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers, making candles, soap, preserving food, and sewing clothes, not just cleaning. There was little shielding from reality. Children witnessed births, deaths, animal slaughter, and violence. They were expected to understand and adapt, not be protected. Formal education was limited and inconsistent. In larger towns, schools might run for a few winter months when farm work paused. One undertrained teacher might teach dozens of students, ages 5 to 17, in a single room. Conditions were poor, freezing in winter, sweltering in summer. Supplies were scarce, shared textbooks, slates reused constantly, and paper treated like gold. Discipline relied on corporal punishment, whippings or beatings for small offenses like whispering or forgetting lessons. In remote areas, there were no schools at all. Some families taught reading and basic math at home, but many kids grew up learning only what was necessary for survival: how to track animals, plant crops, treat wounds. Child mortality was heartbreakingly high. About 1 in 4 children died before adulthood, many in the first 5 years. Diseases like measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough, now easily prevented, were often fatal. Accidents claimed many more lives. Child safety simply didn't exist in a world where risk-taking was necessary to survive. The emotional toll was profound. Most children saw siblings die. Parents expected to lose children. It was common to reuse the name of a deceased child for the next one. Shocking today, but understandable in an era when death was a constant. Few things highlight the gap between then and now more clearly than healthcare. If you got sick or injured in the 1870s West, your experience would be nothing like modern medicine. Doctors were scarce. Many communities had none. Those who did practice often had minimal training. Medical science still relied on outdated theories like balancing bodily humors, more medieval than modern. Without professionals, people turned to home remedies and folk medicine. Every town had local healers, usually women, who used traditions passed down through generations. Some herbal treatments worked, others did nothing or caused harm. Common treatments included bloodletting, purging with harsh laxatives, and applying questionable poultices to wounds, sometimes introducing infection. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely used for pain, leading to widespread addiction. Mercury-based compounds were used despite their toxicity. Even legitimate treatments suffered from impure ingredients and inconsistent doses. Patent medicines, sold as miracle cures, often contained high levels of alcohol, providing relief only through intoxication. Surgery was brutal. Without effective anesthesia beyond whiskey or opium, patients endured unimaginable pain. Sterilization was rarely practiced, leading to rampant infections. Amputation was the go-to solution for serious injuries, done with saws and knives, maybe wiped clean, but never truly sanitized. Childbirth was among the most dangerous experiences for women. Most gave birth at home, attended by a midwife if one was nearby, or else by female relatives, without pain relief, sterile tools, or any guarantee of survival. Without prenatal care, many complications weren't detected until labor began. Breech births, hemorrhages, and other emergencies that modern medicine handles with ease often led to the death of the mother, the child, or both. On the frontier, maternal mortality was staggering. Around 1 in 100 births ended in the mother's death, a rate over 100 times higher than today's developed nations. Many women approached each pregnancy with the quiet knowledge that it could be their last. The combination of poor nutrition, relentless labor, lack of preventive care, and rudimentary treatments meant health outcomes on the frontier resembled those in developing countries today. Life expectancy at birth was under 40 years. Those who survived childhood were often plagued with chronic conditions by middle age, if they lived that long. But beyond the physical hardships, the psychological toll of frontier life was immense. Modern people used to constant communication might find the isolation of the 1870s West nearly unbearable. Letters took weeks or months to arrive, if they did at all. News traveled slowly, distorted by retelling. Major events might remain unknown for months in remote areas, reinforcing a highly localized worldview where immediate community concerns outweighed distant ones. Isolation was especially harsh for women. Those raised in close-knit communities often found themselves alone for long stretches while husbands traveled. Their journals describe profound loneliness and the mental strain of going days or weeks without adult conversation. This solitude sometimes led to what was called prairie madness, extreme depression, anxiety, and even psychosis, triggered by a mix of isolation, overwork, and harsh surroundings. Some became violent or even in more populated areas, social interaction was difficult. Visiting a neighbor could mean walking miles, no small feat when time and energy were precious. Social gatherings were rare, typically linked to church, holidays, or communal labor like barn raisings. Churches were more than religious spaces. They served as social hubs, schools, and support systems. Even non-religious people often attended for the sense of community. Ministers or preachers frequently doubled as teachers, mediators, and civic leaders. The founding of community institutions marked a shift from scattered frontier outposts to real towns. A schoolhouse or church signaled a permanent future rather than a temporary venture. Local governments, though simple, helped bring order and identity. Survival often depended on collective effort. Barn and house raisings let entire neighborhoods help build homes. Harvest teams worked farm to farm, racing the weather. If a child went missing, search parties formed immediately. No one could survive the frontier entirely alone. These traditions of cooperation stood alongside the rugged individualism often associated with the Wild West. In truth, both were essential. Self-reliance for everyday life and community cooperation for the bigger challenges. This tension shaped frontier culture and still echoes in American attitudes about individual responsibility and public support. As another day ends in the Wild West, you reflect on the emotional and mental resilience it took to endure this life year after year. Frontier settlers weren't superhuman. Many broke under the pressure, but others adapted, developing strengths and wisdom that let them persevere through unimaginable difficulty. Night falls again, bringing the silence of a world untouched by industry. You lie under the stars, having glimpsed a reality both distant and deeply human. A world where survival was a constant effort, where comfort was rare, and where death was always close. As sleep nears, you wonder about the people who chose this life, or had no choice at all. What drove them west? What helped them endure so much? And what would they think of the world their sacrifices helped build? A world of safety, abundance, and convenience, unimaginable to them, but made possible by their labor and loss. These thoughts follow you into dreams filled with vast plains, high mountains, and the faces of those who truly tamed the Wild West, not with gunfights, but through quiet, determined persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. Their story, stripped of Hollywood glamour and frontier myth, stands as a powerful testament to human adaptability and to the quiet bravery of ordinary people facing overwhelming challenges. Dawn breaks on your final day in the Wild West. As golden light spills across the land, you pause to admire the raw beauty that lured so many westward. Despite the dangers, the frontier's grandeur was undeniable. Endless prairies rolling like oceans, jagged peaks slicing the sky, and deep canyons echoing with wind and silence. This part of the story wasn't a myth. But the relationship with nature was starkly different from today's. The frontier mindset saw nature not as something to protect, but to conquer and exploit. Forests were stripped bare, game hunted to the brink of extinction, and streams poisoned by mining runoff, without thought for long-term consequences. Nothing illustrates this more than the near extinction of the American bison. Once numbering over 30 million, by 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. The slaughter wasn't just for meat or hides. It was also a government-endorsed tactic to break the Plains tribes by destroying their main resource. General Philip Sheridan allegedly said, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated." Whether or not those were his exact words, the policy was clear. Eliminate the buffalo, and indigenous resistance would collapse. For Native American nations, white settlement brought catastrophe. Their lands, economies, and spiritual lifeways, tied intimately to the land, were uprooted. By the 1870s, most indigenous peoples faced impossible choices: forced reservation life, resistance against overwhelming force, or cultural assimilation. Boarding schools were used as tools of erasure. Native children were taken from their families, stripped of language, dress, and identity. Captain Richard H. Pratt summed up the policy with chilling clarity: "Kill the Indian, save the man." The long-lasting trauma of these policies still echoes through Native communities today. Even when armed resistance occurred, it usually ended in tragedy. One exception was the 1876 Battle of the Little Bighorn, where combined Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces defeated Custer's cavalry. But it was among the last victories. Later campaigns became increasingly brutal, targeting entire villages and civilians. Ironically, many Native nations had complex agricultural practices, governance systems, and deep cultural knowledge that could have enriched settler understanding, if there had been mutual respect. But core differences, like the belief that land could not be owned, made treaties unstable from the start. Cultural conflict wasn't limited to native settler relations. The frontier was a diverse place, shaped by immigrants from around the world, each bringing their own languages, religions, and ways of life. This diversity fueled innovation and community building, but also bred tension as groups competed for limited resources. Chinese immigrants, who helped build the railroads and worked in mines, faced intense racism. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the first major immigration restriction law in the U.S., was born of resentment in Western towns. Chinese miners were harassed, taxed unfairly, and driven from claims through violence. Chinatowns were often targets of riots and mass expulsions. Mexican Americans, many of whom became U.S. citizens when the Southwest changed hands, also faced systemic discrimination. Despite treaty protections, they lost land through legal trickery or outright theft. Their water management traditions, suited to arid climates, were often swept aside by English common law systems ill-fit for the West. Even white European immigrants experienced tension. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants, and Eastern European Jews each formed tight-knit enclaves, preserving language and tradition. These communities offered solidarity, but also made them targets during times of economic stress, when nativist backlash boiled over. African Americans who moved west after the Civil War sought freedom from the harsh racial oppression of the South, but often found new forms of discrimination. Black cowboys, who made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some cattle drives, were nearly invisible in contemporary accounts and later Western mythology. Black homesteaders founded entire communities in states like Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma, yet frequently faced violent hostility from white neighbors and systemic bias in the enforcement of homesteading laws. The frontier was not a unified vision of rugged harmony. It was a place of cultural collisions, where people from vastly different backgrounds, with distinct values and conflicting expectations, struggled to coexist. The romantic idea of the American melting pot obscures the reality. Power imbalances determined which cultures were preserved and which were erased or forcibly assimilated. As the day progresses, you find yourself in a frontier town on the brink of transformation. By the 1870s and 1880s, the era of lone prospectors and independent farmers was giving way to organized corporate expansion. The construction of railroads accelerated this shift. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, travel time from coast to coast shrank from months to days. Rail lines reached into once remote areas, linking them to national. This transportation revolution brought economic integration, but often at the expense of small-scale producers. Individual miners couldn't compete with corporations equipped with industrial tools and capital. Family farms struggled as agribusinesses scaled up. Small ranchers were increasingly edged out by massive cattle operations, backed by wealthy investors and political connections. Corporate interests soon began to dominate not just the economy, but local politics. Rail companies, mining firms, and timber barons wielded disproportionate influence in territorial governments. Land grants, water rights, and mining concessions were often allocated through insider deals, favoring the powerful, leaving smaller operators at a disadvantage. Culturally, the frontier was also evolving. Towns once known for saloons and shootouts were establishing banks, schools, churches, newspapers, and theaters. Dirt roads gave way to surveyed streets, wooden buildings to brick and stone. Local governments passed laws regulating everything from gambling to dress codes. For those who had come west seeking freedom from the rules of civilized life, these changes felt like the end of an era. Some kept moving westward, chasing a vanishing frontier. Others struggled to adjust to the new realities of law, bureaucracy, and social conformity. When the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier officially closed in 1890, it marked more than a geographic milestone. For many, it signified the end of a way of life, one built on hardship, resilience, and independence. It also brought a shift in how the West was remembered. As formal institutions took root, the chaotic violence of the earlier frontier era began to be subdued or rebranded. The infamous outlaws and gunfighters who came to dominate figures like Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Jesse James, and Billy the Kid lived lives far more complicated than the myths suggest. Hickok accidentally shot bystanders. Earp alternated between lawman, gambler, and brothel owner. Jesse James, remembered by some as a Robin Hood, had a past rooted in Confederate guerrilla warfare and left behind innocent victims. By evening, as your journey nears its end, you're left reflecting on the gap between the messy truth of the frontier and the mythology that grew around it. Why did Americans, and later the world, become so enchanted with a sanitized, heroic version of this difficult chapter? Part of the answer lies in timing. The height of Western myth-making occurred just as the real frontier was fading. In the 1880s, Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows began touring, offering staged reenactments of Indian battles and outlaw skirmishes for Eastern audiences. even as railroads and government structures were fully integrating the region into mainstream society. These shows weren't documentaries. They were entertainment tailored to Eastern fantasies. Similarly, the wildly popular dime novels of the time were churned out by urban publishers, often written by authors who had never set foot in the West. These stories followed a familiar script: heroic frontiersmen, dastardly outlaws, noble lawmen, and violent showdowns, all portraying the West as a proving ground for the American ideals of grit, courage, and rugged individualism. As you rise with the morning sun on your final day in the Wild West, you carry not only the dust of the trail, but the weight of history. This land, often remembered through simplified myths and heroic tales, holds a much deeper, more complicated legacy, one shaped not just by pioneers, cowboys, or outlaws, but by displaced nations, forgotten laborers, resilient families, and untold sacrifice. You realize now that the true essence of the frontier lies not in spectacle, but in endurance. The West was built not by lone gunslingers, but by communities weathering hardship together, not by manifest destiny, but by contested ground, negotiated survival, and cultural collision. It was a crucible of both creation and destruction, of possibility and profound loss. And while the cowboy hat, the six-shooter, and the silhouette against the setting sun endure as symbols, they are only fragments of a far richer and more troubling past. The real West lives in the hands that built cabins and railroads, in the voices that were silenced and the ones that persevered, in the soil worked by generations, some free, some not. As you step back into your own world, the contrast is stark. Electric lights, paved roads, running water, medicine, law, and order taken for granted. But you also notice what's been lost: the constant awareness of your environment, the daily tests of self-reliance, the communal bonds forged under pressure. You may never need to shoe a horse, trap your dinner, or fight off a prairie storm. But perhaps you'll see the people of the past not just as relics of folklore, but as complex human beings, imperfect, ingenious, and enduring. And perhaps you'll carry forward some of their spirit. Because history isn't just something we study, it's something we live with. The echoes of the Wild West remain, etched into laws, landscapes, and the American imagination. Not as a fantasy, but as a reality worth remembering, in all its rough edges and raw truth. In the silence of the frontier night, you're left with not just memories, but questions that echo into the present. What does it mean to build a life in the face of uncertainty? What responsibilities do we bear toward the land and toward each other when resources are limited and the stakes are survival itself? The frontier was a crucible, a place that revealed both the best and worst of human nature. Greed and generosity, prejudice and solidarity, violence and tenderness all coexisted in uneasy tension. It challenged every assumption about civilization and demanded new answers forged directly from the land. As dawn begins to warm the horizon, your journey ends, not with a gunshot or a showdown, but with a quiet understanding that history is not made only by great battles or famous names, but by countless acts of endurance, compromise, invention, and hope. The real Wild West wasn't won, it was survived. And in that survival, it helped shape the soul of a nation still reckoning with its past. As you open your eyes once more in your own time, the wind and dust are gone, but the lessons remain, etched in memory, carried forward like the stories once told around campfires